Hey everyone, welcome to the Greg Gardner podcast. This is part 2 of Living with the Wind at Your Back with Dr. David Shaner. Living with the Wind at Your Back is the title of Dr. Shaner's latest book. Remember, you can buy this book at davidshaner.com. That's David, SHANER.com. It's not a book you read and put away. You keep this around for reference. It has 14 exercises that can help you achieve peak performance in really every part of your life. Also, please remember to subscribe to the Greg Gardner podcast and give us 5 stars if you like the podcast. Okay, what we're going to do is we're going to parachute into part 2, where Dr. Shaner and I are having a conversation about the different modes of awareness. Remember, achieving your best performance requires that you are in a state of awareness that is conducive to such performance. Dr. Shaner's outlined 3 levels of body-mind awareness. Third-order body-mind awareness, which is where your intentional vectors are pointing everywhere. This is the constant state of awareness that most people are in most of the time. This state of awareness is accelerated by technology. We're going from thing to thing. We're multitasking, which, by the way, is a myth. We could do a whole podcast on that. But we're everywhere. We're doing many things at the same time, or trying to do many things at the same time, probably not very well. Second order body-mind awareness is where you bring your focus to one thing, one activity. I think of this as getting involved in a singular activity like writing or playing music or conversation or some sort of sports activity. We experience this at work and at play, and this is when we bring our focus to an activity that requires a skill that we have practiced. Now, once we're really good at that, what might happen is we slip into first-order body-mind awareness. This state of awareness is involuntary. So it's when your skills are so sedimented in a particular activity that you lose any directed consciousness about what you're doing. So what we're going to do is we're going to drop in when I'm discussing people achieving first-order body-mind awareness, doing various things like meditation, sports, music performance. Let's drop in as I stumble through this question. Right, and I guess you can achieve this in many different disciplines. For instance, you hear people that have trained their mind in meditation, and they've achieved a glimpse of enlightenment, or every now and then in an athletic performance, they'll talk about it as they're in flow, or they're in the zone, or sometimes they'll even say, oh, he's unconscious, or something like that. And then in music, the same. I mean, when you're playing music in an ensemble, you should be at least in second order body-mind awareness, in my interpretation of it. But every now and then you get a moment.
Yep.
Right? And all of a sudden, and you can only describe that moment afterwards, and you tell your bandmates, you say, wow, what just happened there? And
exactly,
that was a glimpse, and what you want. And I think when you see peak performers, they maximize first order body mind awareness.
Exactly. And so let's take your example. Let's demystify that. What happened was, because of your level of training as a musician is so instilled in your body and your mind, you've habituated an activity that you can perform. You didn't realize it, you slipped into it, but you can actually do it without conscious intention. So what happened was, rather than trying to do, in fact, trying is going to make it worse. What happens is, because of your experience and your the quality of your ability as a musician, that's when people, they say they fall into these peak performance moments, and they describe them as though, space and time has literally shifted. And I think what they're saying is that when you enter a first order mode for the first time in your whole life, where you are not intending the world, you've taken off the rose-colored glasses, suddenly it's a qualitatively different experience. Going from third to second is a quantitative difference.
Right.
Third order is you've got all these different arrows, intentional vectors going out there, and then you calm it down to just one. Well, what happens if you can hold that just one so well that you begin to perform that activity without conscious attention? And that's what first order body mind awareness is. And oh, by the way, enlightenment, is a verb, not a noun. And an enlightened consciousness is a way of engaging in the world where your subjectivity, your ego, that is the author of those intentions, falls away. And that's why it seems like a huge, qualitatively different, mind-blowing experience, when in fact you can begin to cultivate that more and more with mental training, such that you can, tap into that whenever you want.
Yeah, that's amazing. And as amazing as it is, very challenging in today's, and we could do a whole podcast on the myth of multitasking, right? We sort of worship the ability to multitask in today's world, when in fact there is no such thing really.
I completely agree.
Your mind has to do one thing at a time, and this is just a constant third order body mind awareness mindset, right? And
exactly.
Once you realize it, though, you can do many things, but you just have to realize, I think, that's exactly what you're doing. You're doing many things consecutively.
Exactly. And you think you're doing it well, but in reality, you're not. I mean, if you're multitasking, you're really not giving anything your full attention.
One of the fun sides of this whole thing is a story you used to tell about Tohei Sensei and how he would predict which athlete would succeed or fail based on their disposition before they actually performed. Tell us a little bit about that.
Oh, wow. That's a great question and a great topic. So when I was at Uchideshi, so this is like 40 years ago, this is 1979, he would have special classes for us Uchideshi, actually on Friday mornings. And he called them how to see, like look, S-E-E, how to see. And what it was is he was just developing this thing in the Ki Aikido world called Taigi. It's a kind of their arts, but he used this. Well, let me step back for a second. Why did he do this? I got to ask him all kinds of questions because I was a gaijin. That means an outside person, literally, or a foreigner. So I was able to ask Tohei Sensei, why this, why that,
right,
whatever. Because I kind of had an excuse. I was, a foreigner. And actually, Tohei Sensei liked the questions if we did it in private. Because in Japanese, in the martial tradition, to ask your sensei why all the time is totally rude.
It's like you're a 2-year-old.
You just don't do that. Yeah. Yeah. So what Tohei Sensei was concerned about, was he shared with me, is that he didn't want this art, Ki Aikido, to be lost. And he felt unless he trained a handful of people to literally see things and people and performance the way he did, that it could be lost. So he literally taught us in these classes how to observe people and to see their state of mind and body unification or not.
Right.
A fun example of this is, again, when I was Uchideshi at the same time, he was privately teaching a sumo champion, who became a sumo champion. He wasn't when he started with Tohei Sensei, but his name was Kuro Sagawa. This guy was, huge, like a house. And he would come to our dojo, our headquarters there in Tokyo at the time, with like 4 otomo, like 4 people to carry his bags who were young sumotori. And Tohei Sensei would teach him privately in the dojo. Well, he needed an uke, someone to throw. Well, guess who that got to be? It was me. And so I'm there, literally the training partner of a giant sumotori guy. And so we developed a nice relationship. And when the big sumo tournaments happened in Japan, it was like the Super Bowl, right? So it's always, all the matches are televised. So I would watch sumo with Toi Sensei. And let's say you're watching and the announcer says, okay, and the next matchup is going to be Kurosagawa versus so-and-so. And Toi Sensei would get a call from Kurosagawa from the locker room area. And Toi Sensei would give him advice on how to go about handling this particular opponent. Toi Sensei was a real big fan of sumo. So we'd see that conversation, and then they'd come out on TV, and Toi Sensei would just look at both players and tell you who's going to win before it ever started. And he was right, like all the time. And let's say Kurosagawa lost, and then win or lose, he would go back to the locker room and he had to call Toi Sensei again to either be congratulated or to be told maybe what he should have done differently. And Toi Sensei, I would learn by watching Toi Sensei simply watch the cues that people give to you. If you are really, really calm, let's say you're in a first order mode, and your mind is more like a mirror, you begin to see things, even coaching people, that other people don't see, because it's your own intentional vectors that keep getting in the way. The other day, I was at a minor league baseball game, and I was watching the pitcher before, like, the national anthem and the let's play ball and all that. And I'm looking at him and I'm going, boy, this guy just doesn't feel right at all. I mean, I don't even know the guy. It's just, he's a minor league pitcher, he's throwing the ball this guy was throwing the ball at 97 miles an hour. So he's really good. This was the Boston Red Sox farm team. And I said, he just doesn't look composed at all. Well, Greg, in the first inning, he threw 9 straight balls before another ball got fouled off for a strike. So the other team, the third base coach to the other team is just saying, hey, just put your bat on your shoulder. This guy cannot find the strike zone at all. You just don't do anything. Just let him, walk everyone until he gets pulled. And sure enough, he got pulled because he was just off. But it seemed to me really obvious, and I was just kind of nice to be confirmed that, wow, he really was off. It wasn't just me guessing.
Well, that's a very interesting point in the sense that we usually think about peak performance in terms of, and what we've just discussed is in terms of clearing our own intentions out and our own vectors out so that we can, getting them out of our way, getting ourselves out of our own way so we can perform. But what you're talking about here is doing the same thing in order to receive a perception of another person and what their state is, right?
Exactly. So just like doing a key test in Aikido, a key test is two people trying to help each other understand the principles of unification of mind and body. The person giving the test ideally should be much more calm than the person being tested, because the idea of the person testing is to help the person being tested to understand the condition of their own mind. Because again, if they can begin to learn to decipher the difference between when their mind and body is unified and when their mind and body is separate, then they can self-correct all day long, 24/7. So you might learn these principles, in an Aikido dojo or in some peak performance, coaching session. But what you have to do is apply it 24/7. You have to make it a habit. That's what really changes the athlete. So it's not just, well, I want to know about this so I can draw upon it when I need it most. When you need it most is in your daily life, because you want to be more calm, you want to be relaxed, you want to think more clearly, you want to be, non-judgmental, you want to support other people rather than, antagonizing and being stressed out and being totally focused on your own inner world. How can you learn to relax your own inner world and literally change your perspective 24/7? When you do that, or when a peak performing athlete can learn how to do that, they're going to take the principles of how to unify your mind and body and use the power of your whole self, not just your partial self, in order to be the very best you can be when it matters most.
So let's bring this to a more practical place for some listeners that we have. And I think it's really practical in the sense that what you're saying and what you just said there is really, in order to become a peak performer, you don't have to set aside time and say, okay, now I'm going to practice to be a peak performer. You practice it every second of every day. It's not something that you have to say, okay, I'm going to go over here and practice to be a peak performer. It's constant, right? It's a constant practice.
Well, but probably both. I would say that for virtually any peak performing athlete that I work with, I always get them on a breathing and meditation regimen that they do every day. That has to be a habit. But to your point, the training is not, say, that 30 minutes of sitting or 1 hour of sitting or 10 minutes of sitting. That's just to help remind you, what does a unified mind and body look like? What does deep calmness look like? What is your breathing like when you're in that original and natural state? And so your training, whether it's 10 minutes, 30 minutes, an hour a day of breathing and meditation, you're just reminding yourself of that state that you want to carry over for the other 23 hours, 23 and a half hours. Because if you only practice 1 hour a day and the other 23 hours you're living with your mind and body separate, you are not going to change your state. You're not literally going to, rewire your brain in ways that allow you to make a habit living your life with your mind and body unified. So the meditation session is a reminder, helping you to go deeper, more focused, more relaxed. But then you take that understanding, almost like you take a little snapshot of it and you remember what it is and that it wasn't mystic. You yourself learned how to get yourself into that very calm state where your awareness is actually expanded. Your sensitivity to air, to rhythm, to everything around you, to the world around you is actually expanded. So it's not this narrow tunnel vision is what happens to your gaze when you're tense. But when you're meditating and breathing and you have this very relaxed state, you want to take a snapshot of that. And during the day, when you recognize you're tense, you know how to self-correct. You know how to bring yourself back mentally, physically, and emotionally.
So when you're training or you're practicing for a specific event or performance, regardless of what the sport is or what the instrument is for a performance, or whether you're an actor or a comedian or whatever, there's a point in time before the event, you're not going to get any better physically, right? Or from a mobility standpoint, or from a strength or cardio standpoint. All the physical training, muscle memory, that's all been done. You put in all the necessary work. At this point, and I think this will be a little bit of a review, what are the things you can do to increase your chances of your best possible performance?
You have to scan your mind and body and do a check-in. In other words, once you understand how to be relaxed, how to be focused, you've done that through your training, so you know what that looks like. All right? So you're now, as you said, you're at the event, you're in, maybe you're an hour before you perform, or you're in the starting gate, whatever. What you need to do is remind yourself, ask yourself, are you really relaxed? Are you in that state of, even if it's eustress, that is living calmness, it's high energy, but are you relaxed and focused, or are you fearful and have anxiety and worried and anxious? All you have to do is ask yourself, and if you do feel tension, if you do feel combative, if you do feel separate, if your gaze is really narrow, then you know how to self-correct because you've done the work. You've created the habits. You know what tension and stress looks like, and you can immediately shift because you've trained yourself in that very in that very way. So because, as I said, that you're intimate with this, you're able to just kind of do a check. You just check in and say, where's my mind? Where's my body? How am I feeling? What about my emotions? Am I anywhere near even a second order state, or am I clearly in a third order state? Because with this kind of training, you should easily be able to go from a third to a second order state. And that's all you can do intentionally, because it's the first order state is not something you can want to do or try to do.
Right.
It comes from sedimenting the habit of whatever that training regimen is. Yeah. Oh, here's an example.
Okay.
Here's an that people can relate to. Well, people that have learned how to drive a stick shift or a standard, right? Can you drive a stick shift?
Yes, I can.
Okay. So I'm sure there's some listeners out there that have never done that, but for those who have, this is a great example. So let's say, in my case, I learned the first car I drove was a stick shift. So, my parents took me out to some big parking lot, at night when no one was around, right? Because you don't want to hit anything or be a danger to yourself or lose the transmission.
Right.
So just imagine all the intentional cues you're being taught. Okay, you're in the driver's seat. They say, okay, here's the stick. So first of all, that thing down there on your left, that's a clutch. Push that in, and now you're moving the gear shift back and forth. Maybe it's got that typical H pattern. And now, at some point, you're told, okay, you're going to ease off the clutch, gradually press the accelerator, and put it, after you put it in first, we're now going to engage the engine, right? And you can imagine that the whole car is going ka-clunk, 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 because you have to learn that timing between the clutch, the accelerator, and the gear shift. And so when you're learning, that's third order to the max, right? There's all
right.
this confusing stuff. But over time, you kind of learned how to drive. And it became easier. Well, guess what? You didn't go into first order body mind awareness. What happened is you now learned to drive your car without thinking, without conscious attention. You're
right.
just going through the gears. But guess what? Now your mind is free to think about work, problems, family, relationships, opportunities. So what we do is we train our body to do something well, even to the point that we don't have to think about it. And yet the habit of our brain is to fill it up again with more stuff.
Right.
Well, at some point, without your knowledge, you began to drive the stick shift unconsciously. And instead of going from, gee, I learned to do it so well, I don't have to think about it anymore, you would think, oh, gee, now I'm in first order awareness. No, what you do is you fill it up with more stuff. That's the habit, unless you can learn how to sustain your concentration. But I think driving a stick is a great way to say, hey, with training, you can begin to perform. How about this? I could ask you to sit down and play the piano, some song, and you could probably do it without thinking. You just immediately, your body's already trained. Your fingers already know it. You don't have to think about it.
Right.
You can just play the thing and, talk to me about, baseball.
Right.
So what we're doing is saying we do this all the time. There's no reason for us to make it mystical. What we do need is a pedagogy and a discipline to help us manage, the biggest tiger in our life, which is your mind. It's the thing that, people say monkey mind. It just wants to jump around all the time. Well, with training, you can change that. And athletes, peak performers, they're looking for every single edge. And that's why, people seek me out when they're trying to, they're already really, really good. They might be, top 10 in the world, but it's like, okay, their goal is to be the very, very best. So what do they need to do differently in order to take their game to the next level? And usually, or maybe always, it's mental. It's learning to control your mind when it matters most.
Right. And changing the way we think, and changing in order to achieve this type of peak performance or any type of performance requires us to change. And so I want to shift gears a little bit and talk about some of your work in this area around the difficulty of change, what we're really up against as members of the human species, because I know you did a lot of work, and I always like to say you did a lot of work on this before it was cool. Because a lot of people are coming out with, it's evolutionary psychology, and evolutionary biology, but you were doing this work with a lot of really well-known scholars in this area, and I wanted to kind of talk about the difference between the human species and other species and how difficult it is for us to change our behaviors.
Okay, so that's a great setup. So in 1985 and 86, I left Furman University because I was offered a position at Harvard University as a Andrew W. Mellon Faculty Fellow in the Humanities, which meant that I was working, supposedly studying Buddhist texts with a well-known scholar, Masatoshi Nagatomi, in the Yenching Library on the campus of Harvard University, and I was teaching classes in the philosophy department at the same time. But the Yenching Library on the Harvard campus just happens to be across the street from the MCZ, the Museum of Comparative Zoology. And this was at a time when the father of sociobiology, Edward O. Wilson, was teaching, right across, in the building right next to me. And one of his very well-known, famous scientific rivals, but they were in the same department, was Stephen Jay Gould. And Ed Wilson introduced me to Marvin Minsky at MIT, the founder of artificial intelligence. And so I started writing works on, well, let me back up. Why was I interested in suddenly partnering with these biologists and studying evolutionary biology? Because as a comparative philosopher, I knew that these intentions that we've been talking about can become culturally dependent. And people grow up in different places of the world, and literally their brains adopt different worldviews. It's like, language, Broca's area in our brain. You're literally going to have different axon, neuron, node link structure patterns. If your native language is Chinese versus English, literally we are born as living embryos, meaning the only reason why we're born at 9 months is if our head got any bigger, the mother would die. So think of our species as one that has the longest childhood of any species we know of. Meaning, when I grew up, when I was in high school, it was like and even undergraduate, it was like the nature-nurture debate. Is our behavior governed by, our biology, our genes, or is it nature, that is our upbringing? Well, it turns out what I was really interested in and started writing about, in the late 1980s, so this is going way back, I was writing about neuroplasticity and temporal retardation of development. It's called patomorphic morphology. But what it is the brain is developing postnatally. So the brain, let's say the nature part, it's not genes, it's neurons. And so what's happening is you're developing such a culturally dependent worldview that I was asking myself, why is it so hard for people from one culture or religion to actually understand and put themselves in the place of someone from some other religion? Why is studying other cultures so difficult? And what I was suspecting is that we are hardwired in our brain not to get it. So at this time, early on, the theories of neuroplasticity were just coming out, and I was right there, and I was thinking, wow, this is really serving my research in the field called cultural evolution. And so this long childhood of Homo sapien development, we don't reach sexual maturity until into our teens. Well, that's pretty long and pretty late for most species. But what it allows is the opportunity for us to develop in childhood and acquire our culturally dependent worldviews, which allows, the brain to continue to develop. At this time, when I was writing these articles, we thought that the neuroplasticity would end at about age 30. And so my theory was we're literally hardwired to not understand other cultures. The good news is we were right about neotenic development. and its effect on the development of the brain and the likelihood of it being a culturally dependent phenomenon. But the good news is that your brain maintains not the level of neuroplasticity in your youth, but there's still neuroplasticity. So the good news is no matter what your age, it is still possible to rewrite like your brain, that is the neural networks. What Marvin Minsky called way back then, at that time, he wrote the famous book called The Society of Mind, where he came out with the understanding of essentially neural networks, that there is no substratum of the brain or the mind for us to study. Rather, consciousness is an amalgamation of various agencies or societies, that he said, that are working across the brain, that allow the epiphenomenon of which is consciousness.
Right.
But anyway, I get excited about this. I didn't know you were going to go down that path.
Well, yeah. So one of the ways that I really understand just a general overview of this area is that when you look at other species, when they have offspring, they are up and at 'em, man. And the reason is because they're going to get eaten, right? If they don't get up and start moving very quickly, they are lion's food, right? So not the case with us. Like you say, we're born as living embryos, and so we're pretty much helpless for
we're dependent on our parents and guardians for an inordinately long period of time.
Right.
But what's happening in that inordinately long period of time is the possibility of cultural evolution and language and all the things of what we refer to as higher brain function.
And so what I hear you saying is, like, for instance, back then, it turned out that, we finished our neuroplasticity and we kind of sedimented our brains at around age 30. But now new research has come out that says there's still the ability to change those, whatever you would call synapses or networks and things like that, for the rest of your life.
Exactly. And the good news is no matter what the habit, I'm working with people now who suffer from chronic or persistent pain. And the whole issue is you can't make the pain go away, but what you can do is learn how to use your mind differently, such that your whole life is no longer described through your own lens, like that. Instead of those rosy colored glasses, now they're glasses that say my life is defined by chronic pain. And what follows is antisocial behavior, depression, fear of exercise, a whole host of
not to
good
mention
things that
addiction to some substance that might make me feel better temporarily, right?
Exactly. So the good news is that through, again, breathing, meditation, learning how to direct your mind in ways that get off the singular focus of I am suffering from chronic pain, if you use your mind differently and learn how to do that, you're going to get a completely different result, and you can begin to live your life differently without opioids, right? Without, pharma to get you through the day.
Right.
And this is an area of research that's just exploding right now. Because imagine, like, chronic back pain is I think the most debilitating thing to the entire healthcare system. But people just say, I need to go to the chiropractor, I need to go to my doctor, I need back surgery, I need opioids. Nobody knows what it is. Well, it could be getting to know yourself better and your reactions to pain, and how pain is beginning to define your entire consciousness.
Right.
If you can help people to become liberated, that they have a choice, that they can actually be empowered, they can actually choose to live their life differently, that is like very, very exciting to me. And it's all possible because what you're doing is literally rewriting the mechanisms in your brain that have to do with both the reception or the feeling of pain, as well as those mechanisms that cause pain to persist, sometimes beyond what it needs to.
Yeah, and I hadn't planned to go down
That's
this.
probably a whole different program. That's probably a whole different program.
It may be, and maybe we need to come back and talk about some of the things you're involved in around that type of pain management, because we certainly need a new way to look at this, because, I think one of the leading causes of death in the country right now is opioid overdoses, especially with young people. So,
exactly.
um,
Yep.
So one of the things I wanted to kind of come back to is you were talking about neuroplasticity and how, granted, we've learned that now you can change those connections until the day you die, but it's definitely a different process, or it's not as easy, and you can see that by how quickly young people pick up on languages, or how quickly they pick up on musical instruments. There is a difference in that process. But it also goes to one of the reasons why we seemingly can't get along. So the original reason that we got connected on this podcast is that in my podcast number 2, which was entitled How to Have a Conversation with Someone You Disagree With, I talked about a couple of the principles of Ki Aikido around leading your partner, knowing your partner's intention, respecting your partner's energy or ki. And so I wanted to kind of come back to that, because it turns out it's very related to peak performance in general. And I think it goes back to your idea of how do you live in that peak performance, or you live in that way of life, or that the verb you call enlightenment. And because we're not independent creatures, and we rely on being a part of a society and a part of a community, how does this work? And how do we get over this constant just slaying each other constantly and tearing each other down? And I talked about that in podcast number 2. How is this related to peak performance?
You know what? It's the exact same. It's the exact same. So how can I say that? So I just got through mentioning, like, what can you do? Let's say you're doing world championship paddleboarding, or you're doing your extreme soul crushing, Spartan world championship in Lake Tahoe, or whatever your peak performance venue is. You said, what can I do just beforehand to try to optimize my performance? And I said, well, if you're just starting right now, it's probably nothing. But if you've been training in how to unify your mind and body, if you've been developing your ability to focus and relax, then what you do, remember I said you just do a check-in, because it's a big deal. It's a big event. You're there. You've got your participant number on. I mean, you're ready to go. You're at the starting point. Well, how about this? When you're ready to have a conversation with someone that you disagree with, you can probably have enough self-awareness to know, oh, I'm going to possibly be entering this kind of competition. It's not in Lake Tahoe. It's just talking to my friend that
Right.
we continue to have a complete disagreements on, and usually the conversations don't end well. Well, if you know that going into it, why not adopt the exact same strategy of peak performance? Before you go into the conversation where you might get sucked in and suddenly your own bias, judgment, ways of seeing the world might come into loggerheads with someone else, why not say, you know what, I've been practicing my breathing and meditation. Here's another way that I can practice this in daily life. Take a deep breath before you have this conversation. Center yourself. Understand what it's like to rid yourself of tension. And is your gaze open and broad? Is your peripheral vision working right now? Or are you approaching this conversation and already your eyesight's like a laser beam and all you see is this person's face and body? You're not prepared yet to engage in this conversation in ways that are going to have a better outcome. So you want to have conversations when your mind and body are unified.
Right.
You're clear. You're in control of your emotions. But do people take the time to prepare themselves and to learn how to become a less judgmental person that's always trying to correct everyone else and impose your view on others? Imposing views, there's that intentionality again. So you have to prepare yourself to allow the other person to go first, for example. So in Aikido, we say, understand your partner's mind. Well, if you want to understand your partner's mind, oh, they want to hit me like this, or they want to do a front punch like this.
Right.
What you want to do is center yourself to begin with so you can see the person clearly. Well, if you're having a conversation with someone, let them show their mind first. Ask probing questions. Try to imagine you're putting yourself in the place of the other person. It's the golden rule, right? It's like, wouldn't that be a good thing if we all did that? So instead of being so focused on being right and proving your opinion, why not center yourself? Let the other person go first. Listen, ask probing questions, really examine. People like talking about their views, but you might just surface, and why would you think that? What's the root cause of that? Or how did you learn it this way? And you get the person to expose maybe a deeper understanding, leading to greater self-awareness of the person that maybe, you're disagreeing with. But it's not going to do you any good to just engage in verbal combat. And my experience has been when you engage people like this, they unconsciously let down their guard because you're
Right.
not attacking them. You're not making them feel defensive. They don't have to defend themselves if you're not attacking. And so what happens is you can listen to them, you can validate them, you can repeat and confirm so they know you're really trying. And my experience is, in fact, I demonstrated this in that TED Talk that you mentioned,
Right.
is that when you do that, other people are willing to come around and now really listen to a view that you're sharing. Because the way in which you're doing it is you've taken the combativeness and the competition completely out of it, but you had to do it by preparing yourself just as in the same way that you were going into some, a strenuous competition or an important athletic competition. The common denominator is you have to take responsibility for yourself, and you might want to engage in some kind of mental discipline, breathing, meditation, something that begins to allow you to have a greater handle on your own consciousness, your own mental states that you can begin to practice daily.
Right. And I think, and one of the things that I think I've learned over the years is that when you approach this conversation, are you willing to have your own mind changed? Are you approaching it with curiosity enough to, I know Jordan Peterson has a rule that says, assume the person you're talking to knows something that you don't. And if you're seeking that, okay, what am I missing here? Like what, I want to fill in my worldview with things that I'm missing, as opposed to you're wrong and I want to own you, right? That's kind of that's kind of the consensus of what everybody wants to do today is I want to say something that will make you feel wrong and make me feel like I won, right?
Yeah, and you know what? You just hit the nail on the head, Greg. It's this. Let's go back to what is first order body-mind awareness. It's a non-intentional mode of being in the world. Once you taste that first order body-mind awareness, once you begin to experience the world non-intentionally, the reason why it's so dramatically different than anything you've ever experienced is because you've taken that intentional vector of seeing the world through a particular personality lens. And what happens is you recognize, holy cow, my entire worldview could be otherwise. That is, I could go from this kind of blank tablet of first order body mind awareness, and I can conceive now of how other people who might build a completely different foundation for their consciousness based on different belief systems that you have. What you're doing is you're tasting the possibility that you could be wrong. You're tasting the possibility that your worldview is just that. It's the product of your heredity and environment and friendships and talents and training. It doesn't make it bad. It's just makes it particular and unique to your life experience. Once you have an experience that your conscious life could be otherwise,
right,
that is, other than the way you've habitually done it, you become far more likely to be open. In fact, you become really curious about why people think the way they do. And that was my introduction to comparative philosophy. I mean, that's why I went to study at the University of Hawaii with all these incredible teachers that opened my eyes to a completely different worldviews. And it's not singular. Like my master's was with David Kalupahana
right,
in early Buddhism. David was like the world's authority on the earliest Buddhist texts, the Pali Nikayas and Chinese Agamas. And so he taught me a worldview that I never learned in Barrington, Illinois.
right,
It was a completely different way of seeing the world. And then another committee member, Elliot Deutsch, is an Indian expert, Indian philosophy. And so suddenly I'm learning, well, that's a completely different worldview. You know, Buddhism is a heterodox tradition to Hinduism. So Roger Ames, Chinese philosophy, what it taught me through comparative philosophy is you're literally taught how to construct different worldviews. Well, what I recognized through this kind of training, going from third to second to first order body-mind awareness, once you taste first order body-mind awareness, you become aware of the possibility of an early Buddhist worldview, a Hindu worldview, Islamic, whatever. And you recognize, as we said early in this conversation, if you were swaddled up at birth and taken off to any one of those cultures, guess what? You would not be the Greg Gardner that you are now. Yes, you'd have your same genes, but guess what? Your wiring, your brain, your native language might be, Chinese or Swahili or, whatever, Farsi. It's the result of your environment that's pretty much conditioned you to see the world the way you are.
right. And this comes to a question I've always wondered about. There are evolutionary drivers for essentially shutting down the idea of some other way of life. Would you agree with that? I mean, in other words, what's kept me safe so far and what's kept me alive so far is what I must continue to think and do, right? And so what you're really asking and what you're really saying is you have to be able to, traverse those types of evolutionary drivers in order to think differently.
Yes, but
you can
also,
say no. You can say no. I'm just throwing it out there.
Well, yeah, no, you've got the right idea, but it's what I'm going to say is it's not the case. People think, oh, evolution, survival of the fittest, red tooth and claw, Huxley. Within the evolutionary biological community, there are different, what is referred to as targets of selection. So sometimes natural selection, you could say, works at the level of the gene. Richard Dawkins wrote a famous book called The Selfish Gene, positing just that. Darwin thought it was at the phenotypic level, that is, at the level of the individual competing with other individuals. But actually today, it's probably the view that has more traction, referring specifically to Homo sapiens, is that selection could very well be operating at the group level.
Right.
Because if we decide to, for example, our differential reproductive success, which just means passing along our genes, might be more successful if we as a species learn to get along. Because if we were to blow ourselves up in a nuclear holocaust, this whole experiment called consciousness and so-called higher rational thinking, would just turn out to be a big evolutionary blip. Which is, for the most part of our evolutionary history, most species do go extinct. So it's not the case that there's this ladder-like progressive view of historical biological evolution. It's much more of a branching and extinction model. So it could very well be that our ability to survive depends on our ability to get along, to be connected,
right,
to not see ourselves as being separate.
Yes. Okay. So now, so that would then explain, if you look at evolution from a very strict or rigid point of view, there's really no reason anybody should be alive after childbearing years, right? Because I think in that strict view, we're here to reproduce and promulgate the species. But what you're saying is that the reason that there are elders in a tribe is because these wiser, more experienced people were able to make decisions or help the tribe make decisions in order for them to prosper longer so that they could have more offspring. And then what you're saying then is, and their ability to make peace with other tribes guarantees that everyone's able to continue. Am I somewhere over the target there?
No, you're in great shape. Just take the we talk about Homo sapiens, right? Well, what happened to Homo habilis? What happened to Homo erectus? Like, we know that there were species of hominids that are extinct. So was it Homo sapiens that developed some sort of skills to survival and did everyone else under, or what? We don't really know. Right. But what we do know is that our ability as a species, how about this, caring for our environment? How about climate change?
Right.
It's kind of like we can use science as a vehicle to help us understand ourselves better and our environment and all of the conditions we need to, promote the survival of this species called Homo sapiens.
Right. And I'm starting to realize that we could go on for another hour and a half on this topic alone because it's very, very fascinating and very interesting. And I think I just learned something that, like we were just talking about, totally increased my consciousness there in terms of how to understand evolution. But one of the things I wanted to go back to, though, because we are getting up to a time crunch here, is your book. And I've got it here in front of me, and it's just chock full of great information and stories, which I love. I love reading stories. I think that's the best way to learn things is through stories. But also, you added exercises in this book because I think if I know how you think, you're thinking, look, I can't just tell them what to do. I have to lay out a program so that they can habitually do this every day and get to where they need to be. So if you don't mind, could we just go through some of the exercises that you have prescribed here in the book and talk about, why you put them there and what the results of doing them will be?
Okay. Well, there are 14 exercises. There are 7 chapters. It's called, there are 7 arts that I describe in the book. And so there are 7 chapters. And at the end of each chapter, I think chapter 1 has 3 exercises and all the rest have 2. But the journey is sequential. So here's what I did is I tried to write a book that was really a memoir. I was thinking it was a memoir of my life with Tohei Sensei. And it just kind of wrote itself. And I was able to describe, right? I said in the beginning, he wrote a book called Key in Daily Life, and I started to train with him, and I understood that the power of this wasn't just for ski racing. It was for literally everything we do. And that just changed my life. And my whole life has been putting it to the test, taking these principles, these universal principles of how to unify your mind and body, and apply it in athletics and music and academia, even in business. And it's worked my entire life. And so finally I thought, you know what, this is crazy. People would say, David, you've done all this stuff and helped people to become better in all these different fields. You need to write a book on this that people will read. So it was like, well, I don't know how to write a book, for a popular audience. But I sat down and I just started telling stories and put the thing together. And so that's the book. Thanks for mentioning it. And it all starts with the first exercise, which I call writing a personal or positive development affirmation, a personal development affirmation. Because if you're going to go anywhere, well, let's say you're walking into a new mall, right? You're in some city and you need to pick up something, you're going to the mall. You walk in through one of the many doors in the mall, right? What's something you're going to walk in a short distance, I bet, through any of the main entrances, and what are you going to see? you're going to see a big old map because,
right. Oh, yeah.
and
Yep.
in it, there's going to be this little star, and it's going to say, you are here. And then you can
Right.
figure out Sears is over there, Macy's is over there, the running shoes I can get over there. And so that's what you need. If you're on a personal development journey, in the first art, which I call the art of preparation, the first exercise is spending the time to ask yourself, what is it that you're trying to accomplish? Toi Sensei always said, which is true, north or south? That's a question. Which is true, north or south?
Well, I know the answer, so I'm not going to answer it.
Okay, well, it's both, right?
That's both, yeah.
Right? Or what's true, plus or minus, right or wrong, male or female, which is true? So Toi Sensei always said, look, we live in this relative world. All these things are true. Plus is true, minus is true, north, south. But one thing he said is a universal principle. If you want to go north, you have to aim yourself, namely your intentions, north. So one of the biggest things that I think I find when I work with people trying to be engaged in performance improvement is they have not refined as clearly as they need to what is the specific goal that you're trying to achieve. In my life, I change those, all the time.
Right.
When I entered the whole software startup world and became a co-founder of a startup company, I recognized I have never done anything like this at all. So my, personal development affirmation at that time was simply 2 words. And I held on to that for like 4 years. It was fall forward, fall forward. It meant to me, I had a whole context of what I knew that meant. That meant, David, you're going to make all kinds of mistakes. And have some self-compassion.
Right.
It's okay. What's not okay is not to learn from your mistakes. So don't try to get it right the first time. Everyone says startups, and I now can say, you pivot here, you pivot there, you learn something new, you completely change your model, your strategy. And I just knew I'm entering a period where I'm in way over my head doing something I've never done before. So fall forward would be a great goal for me. And that's what I used before I would engage in meditation. For example, figuring that out is exercise 1. Exercise 2 is simply taking the time, maybe 5 minutes in the morning, 5 minutes during the day, 5 minutes in the evening. That's it, a 15-minute commitment to just sit and experience silence. It's not even doing breathing and meditation. It's can you just sit quietly?
That's a hard one.
Well, yeah, but it's beginning to manage what does a monkey mind look like.
That's right.
Or in our language, you're going to sit there and observe third order body mind awareness because you can't change it unless you know it, unless you slow yourself down enough to just be comfortable with silence. 5 minutes. And what I would do is then you add the personal development affirmation, whatever that is, just before your silent period. Because what you're doing is you're beginning to also train your subconscious mind. You're putting something into your subconscious mind and letting it just kind of be there while you're engaged in these moments of silence.
Right.
To give you a sense of the progressive nature, I'm going to be really quick here. Exercise 3. It's kind of what we talked about not being reactive in conversation. Exercise 3 is simply take a breath before you speak. In other words, allow yourself to feel what silence feels like that you've been practicing 5 minutes in the morning, 5 minutes during the day, 5 minutes at night.
Right.
You're beginning to get a familiarity of just being quiet. So can you, in conversation, allow yourself to take a breath, just pause. And what you're trying to do is break the habit of reactive speaking. Where you hear something and immediately all the power of all your intentional vectors goes right at the person because you know what you know and you think you're right and you're very committed and passionate about it. Think it possible you could be mistaken. Well, what do? How about practicing a moment of silence before you speak every time?
Right, and I think it doesn't have to be, for instance, if you disagree with something that was said. But even if it's just a thoughtless response, that's not optimal. And that's not peak performance. I mean, giving someone a thoughtful response takes some time and takes some work. And I think you referred to it a little bit in exercise 5, which is practice compassion through mindful attention, which is very scarce these days, right? I mean, you can't even get people to stop looking at their phone for 10 seconds.
Exactly. And so you've hit on another exercise where there are kind of series of exercises that get a little bit progressively more challenging because, before you go into full-fledged breathing and meditation, which is exercises 8 and 9, which I describe in detail, it would be really nice if you're just practicing moments of these five minutes of silence for some time and practicing in daily life, like take a breath before you speak,
right,
so that when you get engaged in this kind of more challenging activity, which would be breathing and meditation, you're preparing yourself so that the transition is easier, and therefore the likelihood of the positive effects of these exercises sticking is enhanced, because you can't just sit down at the piano and play Rachmaninoff. So trying to start and say, hey, I like exercise 13, I'm going to jump into that, and
right,
you haven't done the other exercises, you're probably not setting yourself up for success. So what I tried to do is figure out what are the things that I've learned along my journey in all these different disciplines and share it with people. I kind of feel like Toy Sensei, so that if I've discovered something, really helpful, then I don't want to, take it to the grave. I've spent my whole life in these different fields trying to understand how can people improve their performance in a variety of different fields and industries. And finally, I thought, you know what, I think I have something to share. And like everything else that I've done, it's going to be not mystic. It's going to be practical. It's going to be sensible. It's going to be things people can do easily. It's not going to require a membership. It's not going to require any gym equipment. It's just learning how to go through life differently, AKA with your mind and body unified, which means calm and relaxed and focused.
Yeah, so I think what we've established really is peak performance in any one thing requires peak performance in everything. It's not just something that's pointed in one direction. It's something that is pointed in 360 every day, 24 hours a day. And while there are places you can practice and things you can do and specific exercises that you can do, the goal is to take it out of those specific things and apply it to daily life, as Tohei Sensei would say.
Exactly. And he gets all the credit. I mean, my life I can't even imagine my life without him. I in the book, I describe him in the beginning as a third parent, because he was a combination of my mother and my father. My mother was the spiritual, theological person, of which Toy Sensei certainly is or was. And also my father, who was the, work before play. You got to have patience and discipline. No one's going to give you a free lunch. Life is about hard work and stick-to-itiveness. I learned all that from my father. Well, Tohei Sensei, as a martial artist, was both spiritual and incredibly strict and disciplined. I mean, really strict and disciplined. So he represented like a combination of my mother and my father. And I just was like drinking, from the fire hose, as the saying goes, my whole life with him. He, by the way, was born in 1920. So next year we'll be celebrating the 100th anniversary of his birth. And he died May 19th, 2011, at the age of 91. So he's no longer with us. His son is now leading us. His name is Shinichi Tohei Sensei, and he's a remarkable teacher and just a terrific leader of the Ki Society worldwide. Anyway, so I feel blessed to be kind of sitting between these two generations, to be able to learn from and know Tohei Sensei so intimately, and also watch the development of our leader, Shinichi Tohei Sensei, who has his own vocabulary, and as you have to do, he has to become himself, which he's become, And I just couldn't be happier for the whole Key Society worldwide to have this incredible transition from the founder, Tohei Sensei, to his son, Shinichi Tohei. I'm just grateful to be living when I'm living.
Well, gratefulness is a great way to conclude here. And what I want to do is, could you tell people, if they want to learn more about you and what you've done, where can they find more information? Where can they buy your book, etc.?
Okay. You can buy the book by going to davidshaner.com. So that's it, davidshaner.com. On the homepage, you'll see a number of books, but this one, Living with the Wind at Your Back. The book trailer's there. If you go, I think there's a link under my name. You might have bio in different books, but you can order the book there. They'll usually ship it to you, and you'll have it in 2 or 3 days. I don't have a big social media platform, so I don't know if this is okay. Can I give my email address out?
Sure.
So basically, it's dshaner@davidshaner.com. And I do respond to my email. That's how I communicate with people, my students, people who read the book. You're welcome to ask me questions. I do, consult to businesses and athletes, musicians, people trying to take their game to the next level. I don't have a big social media platform, as I said. So if you just go to davidshaner.com, and if you write to me at dshaner@davidshaner.com, I'll be sure to connect with you and respond to you.
Also, a search on YouTube will bring up a number of different videos that in different places. You've racked up quite a eclectic number of speeches and talks, and also Aikido demonstrations and things like that. That you can find the TED Talk out there. But I'll also add all this to the show notes so that people can go to the show notes and click on whatever they want to. But Dr. Shaner, it's been great. It's been an honor for me to have you on the podcast, and hopefully we can come back and do more, because there are a number of different areas that I think we stopped ourselves from getting into here that we could have gone longer on. But I really appreciate you joining us today, and would love to have you back sometime.
Well, thank you very much, Greg. And let me tell you, maybe one of my favorite podcasts of all time is your first podcast. That was really creative. That was really creative and insightful on so many different levels. For those of you who haven't heard the first podcast, where Greg says, here's 5 reasons why this is my last podcast and I'll never do a podcast, it is really insightful and creative and entertaining. And I can't imagine anyone not hearing that first podcast, and it's going to resonate. If you've ever been held back, like you thought you were going to do something and you come up with all the typical excuses of why you can't, I don't have time, I don't have energy, I've got these other commitments, I just can't do it. You went through them point by point, and I just thought I became a fan of your podcast right away. So
well, I appreciate that. And I still think about that stuff every day, and I try to keep going. But I really appreciate, this is going to be great. I look forward to the feedback. For you folks that are listening, please go rate my podcast and also subscribe. When you subscribe, it gives me a chance to get more guests and to grow the podcast to even bigger subjects and broader subjects. So thank you very much, David. We'll talk to you soon.
All right. Thank you, Greg.
All right.
Thanks
Bye-bye.
to your listeners. Bye-bye.